Scientists ran the DNA of Black Americans against every modern European country: Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal. They mapped the genetic markers, ran the analysis, and compared population by population. Only one European nation kept showing up as the dominant match inside Black American DNA, not the country most people would guess, not the one most people even think about when they think about Black history in America. When you understand why, when you understand the history behind that match, it does not just change how you think about DNA, it changes how you think about America itself. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. Let's start with what scientists were trying to figure out in the first place. For decades, geneticists knew that Black Americans, formerly called African Americans in the research, carried a complex mixture of ancestries. That was never in question. What was harder to answer was the specifics. Which African ethnic groups? Which European populations? In what proportions? And how did those proportions vary across different regions of the country? The tools to answer those questions with real precision did not fully exist until the 21st century, but once they did, researchers moved fast. In 2014, a landmark study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics analyzed the DNA of hundreds of thousands of individuals using data from 23andMe. The team included scientists from Stanford University and other institutions. What they found reshuffled assumptions across the board. The average African American genome, they found, is approximately 73 to 75% African in origin, about 24% European, and roughly 0.8% Native American, a small but measurable trace of indigenous ancestry. But that 24% European figure, that's where things get interesting, because 24% is not a footnote. That's nearly 1/4 of an entire genetic identity, and scientists wanted to know, where in Europe did it come from? To answer that, researchers at Oxford University, University College London, and the Università del Sacro Cuore in Rome joined forces for a study that would become one of the most detailed genetic forensics of the Americas ever attempted. The team analyzed more than 4,000 DNA samples from 64 distinct populations, not just in the Americas, but across both Europe and Africa. Their method was called haplotype-based analysis. Instead of just looking at isolated gene variants, they mapped entire stretches of chromosomes, long sequences of genetic code that travel together through generations, and compared those patterns between donor populations in the old world and recipient populations in the new world. Think of it like this: a single word can appear in dozens of languages, but a specific phrase, a specific combination of words in a specific order starts to narrow things down considerably. Haplotypes work similarly. They are long, specific, combinatorial sequences that act like genetic fingerprints, pointing back toward a particular ancestral group with a level of precision that isolated markers cannot match. The question they were asking was straightforward. When you look at the European DNA inside African Americans, which European populations does it most closely resemble? They tested every major European population. They ran the comparisons systematically. They eliminated mismatches one by one. Scandinavia did not match. The Iberian Peninsula did not match. Southern Europe did not match. Central Europe did not match. Eastern Europe did not match. The researchers were not guessing. They were not relying on historical assumptions or cultural stereotypes. They were reading the actual sequence of human DNA, billions of base pairs, and letting the biology speak for itself. The beauty of haplotype analysis is that it does not care about national borders, political narratives, or what anyone assumed to be true going in. It just shows you the pattern, and then it shows you where that pattern came from. And the answer that came back was the same every time. Great Britain, the most common European genetic source inside African American DNA by a significant margin, was British. Specifically, the genetic clusters associated with England, Scotland, and to some extent Ireland, not Spain, even though Spain was a massive colonial power in the Americas. The Spanish genetic signal showed up prominently in Latino populations, particularly those with ancestry from Mexico, Ecuador, and Colombia. but not in African Americans. Not Portugal, even though Portugal launched the transatlantic slave trade in the 15th century. Not France, not Germany, not the Netherlands, though the Netherlands ran slave operations in South America and the Caribbean for decades. The dominant European signal in Black American DNA pointed overwhelmingly to Britain, to the islands off the northwest coast of Europe, to the people who settled Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and the plantation belt of the American South. And the reason why is written in history as clearly as it is written in genes. Britain's role in the transatlantic slave trade is one of the most consequential and most under-discussed chapters in world history. The British Royal African Company, chartered in 1672, was at one point the largest slave trading operation in the world. Between the late 1600s and 1807, when Britain formally abolished the trade, British ships transported an estimated 3.1 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. A significant portion of those people were delivered to British colonial territories in North America, the colonies that would eventually become the United States. It was not just the number of people transported, it was the duration, the intensity, the legal architecture that Britain built around the institution. Virginia passed its first slave codes in 1705, decades of legislation that systematically stripped enslaved people of legal personhood, criminalized literacy, and entrenched the racial hierarchy that would define American life for centuries. Those laws were British laws. They were enforced by British-descended courts, sheriffs, and militias. The plantation system that emerged in colonies like Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, and Maryland was overwhelmingly English-run. The landowners were English. The colonial administrators were English. The laws governing the institution of slavery were written in English by men who traced their ancestry to the British Isles. By the mid-1700s, tobacco in Virginia, rice in South Carolina, and indigo across the Lowcountry had made some of these plantation owners among the wealthiest people in the British Empire. That wealth was built entirely on enslaved labor, and the proximity between enslaver and enslaved, forced, constant, and grotesquely unequal, is precisely why the genetic signal transferred the way it did. And critically, and this is the part that genetics makes undeniable, the European DNA that entered Black American lineages during those centuries of slavery came primarily from those same British men. The Harvard Medical School confirmed this in a 2023 study when researchers examined the DNA of 27 individuals buried at Catoctin Furnace in Maryland, enslaved and free African Americans from the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Many of these individuals had European ancestry, and that ancestry, the study found, came mainly from Britain and Ireland, and mainly on the paternal side. The phrase paternal side carries enormous weight here. It means Y chromosome transmission. It means ancestry traced through the father's father's father. And given that enslaved African American women were systematically and violently exploited by their white enslavers as documented not just historically, but now genetically, the concentration of British DNA on the paternal side is not a coincidence. It is evidence, biological evidence of what enslaved women endured. If you're watching this channel for the first time, hit subscribe. We cover the science of human ancestry, genetics, and history in a way you genuinely won't find anywhere else. Every video is rooted in peer-reviewed research. This story is far from over. Now let's talk about the other side of the equation. Because the British DNA is roughly 24% of the average Black American genome, that means the other 73 to 75% is African. And that African component tells an equally extraordinary story. Which African peoples exactly did Black Americans descend from? This is where genetics collided with one of the most shocking findings in the entire body of research. It came from a 2020 study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, led by scientists at 23andMe. They used genetic data from more than 50,000 people of African descent. The study compared DNA from Black Americans to populations across the African continent. The researchers expected to see a spread of West and Central African ancestry, roughly mirroring the historical shipping records of the transatlantic slave trade. Those records show heavy contributions from Senegambia, Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast, modern Ghana, the Bight of Benin, and the Congo-Angola region. What they found matched that picture in some ways, but in one region the results were dramatically higher than the historical shipping records would predict. Nigeria, specifically ancestry linked to the Yoruba, the Igbo, and the Isan peoples of modern-day Nigeria, appeared in Black American DNA at rates far beyond what the documented slave ships would suggest. The researchers were genuinely puzzled. The shipping records showed relatively few enslaved people being brought to North America directly from the region of modern-day Nigeria. So why was Nigerian ancestry so dominant in the genomes of Black Americans? The answer turned out to be hidden inside America itself. Enslaved people weren't just moved from Africa to America. They were moved within the Americas. The intracontinental slave trade, the buying, selling, and forced relocation of enslaved people within the United States, was massive. After the transatlantic slave trade officially ended for United States ports in 1808, the domestic slave trade exploded. Between 1808 and the Civil War, an estimated 1 million enslaved people were sold and transported from the Upper South, states like Virginia, Maryland, and Kentucky, down into the Deep South, to Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. Entire families were torn apart at auction blocks. Children were separated from mothers, husbands from wives. And with every forced relocation, ancestries mixed and scattered in ways that no shipping manifest, no census record, no plantation ledger could ever fully capture. Enslaved people from the Caribbean, particularly from British colonial islands where Nigerian ancestry was highly concentrated, were also trafficked into the American South. That Caribbean to mainland pipeline carried Yoruba, Igbo, and Isan lineages deep into American soil through routes the official records barely documented. Those internal movements created a kind of genetic mixing that the ship manifests alone could never capture. The genetic record is more complete than the paper record. What it shows is that the Yoruba, Igbo, and Isan peoples of Nigeria, among the most populous ethnic groups in all of Africa, became one of the defining ancestral pillars of Black America. Even when that connection was not direct, the ancestors of current-day Yoruba people from West Africa provided one of the largest ancestral contributions to African Americans of any single ethnic group, and that connection survived 4 centuries of forced displacement, cultural erasure, and systematic destruction of records. Now here's where the picture expands even further, because British ancestry and Nigerian ancestry are the 2 dominant signals. They are not the only ones. When you layer in the full picture, you are looking at one of the most genetically complex populations in human history. The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, a massive historical archive of documented slave voyages, combined with modern genetic analysis, suggests that roughly 25% of Black American ancestors came from the Senegambia region. That includes the ancestors of Wolof, Mandinka, and Fula peoples. Another 25% came from the Congo-Angola region, including ancestors of the Bakongo and related Central African peoples. There is measurable Ghanaian ancestry from the Akan and Ashanti peoples. There is ancestry from the Bight of Benin, the region of modern Benin, Togo, and western Nigeria. There are smaller but detectable traces from the Bight of Biafra and the Windward Coast. All of this, layered over centuries on top of a foundation that was overwhelmingly African, was shaped by some of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth. The Yoruba built city-states with populations that rivaled medieval European capitals. Ile-Ife, considered the spiritual homeland of the Yoruba people, was producing bronze and terracotta art of extraordinary technical precision centuries before European contact. Benin City, part of the broader Yoruba-adjacent world, had a system of walls and moats that a 15th century Portuguese explorer described as more impressive than anything he had seen in Europe. The Kingdom of Congo had a diplomatic relationship with Portugal in the 1490s, decades before most European nations were communicating with Africa at all. Congolese ambassadors sat in European courts. Congolese nobles corresponded with the Vatican. The Wolof had a formal empire, the Jolof Empire, stretching across what is now Senegal, Gambia, and Mauritania. The Akan built Ashanti, a confederacy whose military and legal sophistication stunned European observers, and whose gold trade had shaped Mediterranean economies for 1,000 years before European ships rounded the Cape. These were not peripheral societies. These were major civilizations at the height of their complexity, societies with laws, universities, trade networks, religious institutions, artistic traditions, and political philosophy. And then the slave trade came. Deliberately and systematically, the enslaved were stripped of their names, their languages, their family structures, their religions, and their histories. The goal was total erasure. These were the people whose descendants became Black Americans. Not abstractions, not a generic African category. Specific peoples with specific languages, specific cosmologies, and specific ways of organizing family, governance, and faith. Slavery erased the names. The genetics is giving them back. There's one more layer to this story, and it has to do with geography, specifically with how the European DNA is distributed across Black Americans depending on where they live. The 2014 American Journal of Human Genetics study found something striking when the researchers broke down the data by region. Black Americans living in the American South have, on average, a higher proportion of African DNA, roughly 83% African ancestry, compared to Black Americans outside the South, who average closer to 80% African ancestry. The European component, by contrast, is slightly higher among Black Americans in northern and western states. Why would that be? The researchers proposed a theory rooted in the Great Migration, the massive movement of Black Americans out of the South from 1910 to 1970. During those 6 decades, an estimated 6 million Black Americans left southern states and relocated to cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, Cleveland, Los Angeles, and Oakland. It was one of the largest internal migrations in American history. The motivations were clear: escaping Jim Crow laws, racial terror, economic exploitation, and the systematic violence of the post-Reconstruction South. Their hypothesis was that the Great Migration was not genetically random. Black Americans with a slightly higher proportion of European ancestry, who on average had lighter skin, faced somewhat different, though not equal, social conditions in the Jim Crow South. Colorism, discrimination based on skin tone within the Black community and between Black and white Americans, was a documented and devastating social force. Some people had marginally greater access to resources, education, and mobility. That marginally greater mobility meant they were statistically more likely to be among those who could migrate north and west. The researchers were careful to frame this not as a compliment to lighter skin, but as an indictment of the system. The fact that European ancestry that entered Black lineages through rape and coercion, then conferred even marginal social advantage under Jim Crow, is one of the more searing ironies in American history. The crime compounded itself across generations, which means that even the geography of Black America today, which cities have larger Black populations, which regions reflects the fingerprints of discrimination. The sorting of human beings by skin tone, which itself reflects the proportion of European versus African ancestry in the genome, continued to shape Black American migration patterns long after the Civil War ended. Racism did not just affect history. Racism is written in the spatial distribution of genetics. So where does this leave us? When Oxford and UCL ran the analysis across every modern European country, comparing British DNA, French DNA, Spanish DNA, German DNA, Italian DNA, Dutch DNA, and every other European population against the genomes of Black Americans, they kept arriving at the same answer: Great Britain. Not because Britain is special, not because Britain was the largest slave trader overall, Portugal and Brazil moved more enslaved Africans in total, but because Britain was the dominant colonizing power in North America, because the plantation system in the American South was overwhelmingly British in its origin, because the men who owned enslaved people, who built the tobacco and rice and cotton economy of colonial and antebellum America, were almost universally of British descent, and because the biological consequences of what those men did to enslaved women, consequences that no record keeper documented, that no official census captured, are now permanently embedded in the DNA of tens of millions of living people. Think about what that means for a moment. The men who wrote laws declaring black people to be property, those men's DNA is now inseparable from the people they enslaved. It cannot be removed. It cannot be erased. It cannot be legislated away. It lives inside the genome of every descendant permanently, generation after generation. The oppressor and the oppressed are biologically intertwined in a way that history tried to pretend never happened. The genome does not lie. It does not forget. It does not get burned in courthouse fires or locked away in archives. It carries everything. The Yoruba survived the Middle Passage and became the genetic backbone of Black America. The Wolof survived chains and became part of one of the most resilient cultural identities the modern world has ever produced. The Bakongo survived the plantation and planted seeds in American music, food, language, and faith that shaped Western civilization in ways historians are still uncovering. Every blues chord, every gospel note, every rhythm that became jazz, rock and roll, hip hop, and R&B, all of it traces back to those specific peoples: the Yoruba talking drum, the Bakongo concept of the ring shout, the Wolof griot tradition of oral history and rhythmic storytelling. These were not erased, they were transformed. They crossed the ocean in the minds and muscle memory of people who had nothing else left, and they became the cultural foundation of the most influential popular music in human history. And the British DNA, the genetic signature of the men who held the whip, became involuntarily an inseparable part of the story too. That is what the science found when it compared Black American DNA to every modern European country. One match, one history, written in every cell. If this video reached you, it was supposed to. Subscribe if you want to go deeper.